Joining us here today at the photography show, long-time National Geographic photographer, campaigner, winner of far too many awards, Annie Griffiths. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here.
It's a pleasure.
Now, you've been sharing your journey in photography and in life with visitors to the photography show today. I want to talk about, first of all, one of your most recent journeys to Antarctica. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's the 7th continent. I had wanted to go there my whole life, and it was really life-changing, David. Yeah, I mean, for one thing, it's like no other place on Earth. And the thing that really bowled me over was to see that conservation in that region has really worked. And I mean, we saw hundreds of whales. We saw millions of seals and penguins. And a lot of that is because countries came together and said, no more whaling. You know, there were so many animals that were hunted to near extinction. And then to come back and see the bounty, and they even did things like eradicated the rats so that the birds who nest on the ground would be okay. And believe it or not, they eradicated reindeer, which had been, introduced by the Norwegians because I think they wanted a good steak, but of course devastating for the continent of Antarctica.
Of course, it's heartening, I find, when you talk about that, about international collaboration making change.
Oh, isn't it?
In times when countries are too often looking inwards and shutting the outside out. To hear tales of collaboration really making that change for good.
Oh, it's so important, and then those countries have to hold the other countries accountable who aren't abiding by the global viewpoint.
Yeah. I want to talk about some of your earlier work. In fact, let's go back pretty much to the beginning, and it's been well documented that you were one of the first women to work with National Geographic. I want to take you back to your first assignment, if that's still fresh in the mind in any way. But,
oh, sure.
But how was that? Where did they send you, and what kind of lessons did you learn that have propelled you on your journey since then?
Well, my first assignment was really kind of in my own backyard. It was up along the Minnesota-Canadian border, and it was this kind of liquid border between the two countries with lakes and wilderness. It was really lovely, but a real opportunity for me because I was so young and I knew it so well. So when you take things like language and disease and travel and stuff out of the equation, some people think, well, that'll be hard to take pictures, but actually for me it was a place I was comfortable, and once I completed that project I was ready for the next, and then for international travel.
Yeah, so how about your international travel? Again, as you admit, a young photographer when you were first venturing out.
Very young.
I've seen one or two images of you when you were first setting out doing your international journeys, you know, with the elephant on your t-shirt, I think it was, and the glasses, traveling to, were you in Africa in the first time?
The first time I left the country, other than to go into Canada, was I went to Namibia, which at that time was still called Southwest Africa, and apartheid was alive and well, and it was a hugely eye-opening trip, especially because I was able to work with very remote women in tribes that were remote. And I learned so much from them. As a kid, you know, I was 25, and to learn from these women who were surviving in a place where I couldn't possibly survive really changed my perspective of poor women in the developing world.
Was language, was communication a barrier, did you find? I mean, I guess when you've got a camera, that's an international language in many ways, isn't it?
Well, no, because they didn't know what a camera was.
Of course.
I mean, this was really remote, but I did have a Polaroid. And when I took a picture of them with my Polaroid, they had no idea what I was doing. And they had no idea what that little square was. But as it came up...
Of course, because it would have come out blank.
Yes, which was so fun, because they're looking at this thing and then suddenly they're seeing themselves. But and they just started laughing hysterically. And it was like a really interesting enlightenment laugh, because I realized then in an instant that none of the women had seen her own face before. Right. Because there were no reflective surfaces, there certainly were no photographs. And so they were literally saying to each other, that's you, which, you know, I tear up thinking about it now.
that connection with women in the world, that's something that's continued throughout your work, throughout your career, and we'll come on to ripple effect in a moment. But looking inwardly on the photography industry, and I'm not sure how much of a view you have on that actually, but equality in the industry has been a talking point for a number of years now. What's your view? Do you feel as though our industry is on a journey towards recognizing itself, towards recognizing equality more than it has in the past?
Oh, very much so, and it's a long journey. I mean, I was at the beginning of that journey, but this year at National Geographic is the year of the woman. Right. We have a woman editor of the magazine. We have a woman director of photography. I believe we have a woman CFO. You know, so yes, and what I care about is not just equality for women, but representation of the world we cover. And I was one of the beneficiaries of the director of photography when I was very young, realizing that he needed people who could tell the other stories. But you know, if we, in the United States, we have a huge Hispanic population. We need Hispanic photographers. We have, of course, a huge black population. Well, we have the world, honestly. And then when you cover global stories, it's just a fact that if you come from a culture, you know what the stories are, and you have that perspective that somebody just parachuting in might not have. So diversity is key to journalism.
And continuing along with that theme, your work now with Ripple Effect. For any of our viewers who haven't come across what Ripple Effect does, just to share with us.
Well, we're called Ripple Effect Images.
Sorry, yes.
Which I call the other REI, and it's a group of National Geographic photographers, mostly women, but we've got some great guys too. And we're committed to documenting the stories of 8 organizations that are empowering women in the developing world, women and their kids. And we're especially interested in the underreported stories because there are so many. I mean, tragically, very few people on Earth know what the biggest killer of women and kids in the developing world is. And I won't ask you because you know, I've spoken to groups of physicians who didn't know, and it's household air pollution kills more people than AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis combined, and yet we don't know about that. Well, that's because there aren't a lot of people in media who come from poor huts in the developing world, and there aren't a lot of, you know, but women find out sooner because I'm with the women, I'm in their homes, I see, you know, and I feel the smoke. And
I was going to say, what kind of pollutants are we talking about here when it comes to household air pollution that's so damaging?
You're talking about open fires that are needed for cooking and heating often, and they're built with whatever is available. So some are wood, some is kerosene, which is toxic, animal dung, peat, you know, sort of anything that's available to build a fire, to stay warm and to cook. But it's you know, fossil fuels. It's stuff that gets into the lungs and gets into the eyes and causes tremendous upper respiratory disease. Pneumonia is what kills the kids.
And it's an invisible killer, and I guess that if that's the environment into which you are born, you become desensitized to it, so as to, obviously not physically desensitized, but you don't even notice that it's there, I guess?
The women do.
Okay.
The women do, and they know their babies are coughing, and they know they don't feel good, and they know that their eyes are burning, and so they know, but what they don't know is that there's an alternative. And there is.
And how do you make that change happen then? I mean, you've identified what this biggest killer is, but the reasons behind that are so ingrained in culture and society, and the fabric of how houses are built, for example, you mentioned there. So how do you make that change?
Well, you make that change the way you tackle any global health issue. It's complicated, but it's preventable. So if it's malaria, you get malaria nets. If it's cook stoves, you bring in clean cook stoves, and you teach women how to make them, and you teach women how, you give it to them to sell, so that they're invested in making sure that their girlfriends like the stoves and like the, you know, it's step by step, and it takes, and it's really starting finally to pick up speed now. but it takes global will. It takes a recognition of the price of bad health in the world, but most importantly, it takes a recognition that this can and needs to be fixed.
And recognition is where ripple effect images can come in and to tell these underreported stories like you say.
Yes, and to shine a light on the solutions. That's what we're very much about, is not being reactive and saying, oh, poor them, poor them, poor them, but much more being proactive and saying, who's doing something about this? And is it working? And then what happens? That's why we're called ripple effect images, because when you solve one problem for a woman, she goes right on to the next problem. And she pays it forward to her kids and her parents and her girlfriends. And so it has a multiplier effect that just is part of the biological imperative of a woman.
Annie, it's been terrific speaking to you just now. Thank you so much for sharing your journey, the important work that you've been doing all over the world here with visitors to the Photography Show.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it.